It was a bright and sunny afternoon in Oakwood Lane. This was a quiet little street where things stayed calm and boring, or at least, that's what everyone thought. Nothing exciting ever seemed to happen here. The houses all looked the same, with neat lawns and clean sidewalks. Kids rode bikes sometimes, and old people walked their dogs. It was the kind of place where you'd think everyone got along. But oh boy, were things about to change. Let me tell you about Jake Miller. He was the new guy who just moved in. Jake wasn't loud or flashy. He didn't throw big parties or make a lot of noise. Nope, he was super quiet. He kept to himself most of the time. Every day, you could see him outside his new house, working hard. He'd hammer nails into wood, paint the walls, or fix little things here and there. His house was old when he got it, but he was making it look nice again. Jake had short brown hair, a friendly smile, and wore plain shirts and jeans. He seemed like a regular guy, just someone trying to settle into his new home. But not everyone liked Jake being there. Across the street lived a lady named Karen Baxter. Now, Karen wasn't just any neighbor. Oh no, she was the boss of the neighborhood, or at least, she thought she was. Karen was the head of the HOA. That stands for Homeowners Association, which is like a club that makes rules for the neighborhood. Karen loved rules more than anything. She carried a clipboard everywhere she went, writing down stuff she didn't like. If your grass grew too tall, Karen would know. If your trash can stayed out too long, Karen would see it. She had sharp eyes and a loud voice, and she wasn't afraid to use them. Karen's house was perfect. Her grass was always cut just right. Her flowers were bright and pretty, lined up in neat rows. She even had a little sign in her yard that said, "Oakwood Lane's best neighbor." But the truth? A lot of people didn't think she was the best. They thought she was nosy and mean. Karen had a glare that could scare anyone, even a big, tough grizzly bear. When she looked at you with those angry eyes, you'd feel like running away. And when Jake moved in, well, Karen decided right away that he was trouble. From the very first day, Karen watched Jake like a hawk. You know how a hawk flies high in the sky, staring down at everything below? That's how Karen was with Jake. She'd stand on her porch, arms crossed, staring across the street. She'd squint her eyes and frown, like she was trying to figure him out. Jake didn't do anything wrong, but that didn't matter to Karen. She didn't like new people. She didn't like change. And she really didn't like that Jake's old house looked a little messy while he fixed it up. To her, messy meant bad. Jake didn't seem to notice Karen at first. He just kept working. He'd hammer and paint and sweep, whistling a little tune while he did it. Sometimes he'd wave at the neighbors who walked by. "Hi there," he'd say with a big smile. Most people waved back. They thought Jake seemed nice. But Karen? She never waved. She'd just huff and turn away, like Jake's friendliness was a crime. She was waiting for him to mess up. She wanted a reason to march over and tell him off. And trust me, Karen was good at finding reasons. Now, here's the fun part: Jake wasn't just some regular guy with a hammer and a paintbrush. Nope, he had a secret. A big, juicy secret that nobody in Oakwood Lane knew about, not even Karen. He wasn't loud about it. He didn't brag or show off. Jake kept it hidden, like a treasure buried deep underground. While he worked on his house, he acted normal. He smiled and waved and said hello, just like any other neighbor. But deep down, something about Jake was special. Something that would surprise everyone, especially Karen. What do you think his secret could be? Was he a superhero hiding from bad guys? Maybe he was a famous person trying to live a quiet life? Or could he be something else, something sneaky and clever? I'm not going to tell you yet. You'll have to keep reading to find out. But I'll give you a little hint: Jake's secret was going to turn Karen's perfect little world upside down. She had no idea what was coming, and that's what makes the story so exciting. Let's talk more about Oakwood Lane for a second. It was one of those places where everyone knew everyone. The same families had lived there for years. Mr. Johnson down the street always mowed his lawn on Saturdays. Mrs. Carter next door baked cookies for the kids every weekend. People liked things to stay the same. That's why Jake moving in was a big deal to some folks, especially Karen. New people meant new problems, she thought. And Karen hated problems more than anything. Jake's house was right across from Karen's. His place was small, with a little porch and a big tree in the front yard. The paint was peeling when he moved in, and the windows were dusty. But day by day, it started looking better. He painted the walls blue, fixed the porch steps, and even planted some flowers. It was hard work, but Jake didn't mind. He liked making things nice. And honestly, most of the neighbors didn't mind him either. They'd stop by sometimes and say, "Looking good, Jake." He'd just grin and say, "Thanks. Still got a lot to do." Karen didn't see it that way, though. To her, Jake's house was an eyesore. She didn't care that he was fixing it. She didn't like the noise from his hammer or the pile of wood in his yard. One time, she even complained about his truck. "It's too big," she said, stomping her foot. "It doesn't fit with our street." Jake just nodded and said, "I'll park it better tomorrow." He never argued. He never got mad. He just kept going, calm as could be. But Karen wasn't calm. Not one bit. Every morning, Karen would peek out her window to check on Jake. She'd sip her coffee and mutter to herself. "What's he up to now?" she'd say. "He's going to ruin this neighborhood, I just know it." She'd write little notes on her clipboard, things like "Jake's grass too long" or "Jake's mailbox ugly." She had a whole list of complaints, even though Jake wasn't breaking any big rules. Karen didn't need a real reason to be mad. She just didn't like him, plain and simple. The other neighbors started noticing Karen's grumpiness. "She's at it again," they'd whisper to each other. "Poor Jake doesn't even know what he's in for." And they were right. Jake didn't seem bothered. He'd wave at Karen sometimes, like he was trying to be nice. "Morning, Ms. Baxter," he'd call out. But Karen would just glare and walk away. She wasn't going to be friends with him. No way. She was too busy plotting how to make him follow her rules. But here's the thing, Jake wasn't worried about Karen. Not even a little. While she watched him and made her lists, he kept working on his house. He'd fix the roof one day, then the fence the next. He moved slow and steady, like he had all the time in the world. And that secret of his? It stayed locked up tight. Nobody could tell by looking at him. He didn't act strange or sneaky. He just seemed like a normal guy who liked fixing stuff. But oh, how wrong they were. Let's imagine what it was like for Jake that first week. He'd wake up early, before the sun even came up. He'd make some coffee and sit on his porch, watching the street wake up. Birds would chirp, and the air would smell fresh. Then he'd grab his tools and get to work. Hammer, bang, saw. He'd make all kinds of noise, but not too loud. He didn't want to bug anyone. Well, except maybe Karen, but that wasn't on purpose. She just didn't like anything he did. One day, a kid named Tommy rode his bike past Jake's house. "Hey, mister," Tommy called. "You building a castle or something?" Jake laughed. "Nah, just fixing my house," he said. "Wanna help?" Tommy shook his head and pedaled off, but he smiled. Jake was good at making people like him. Even the dogs on the street wagged their tails when he walked by. Everyone seemed to think he was okay, everyone except Karen. Karen had her own morning routine. She'd wake up, put on her fancy robe, and check her yard. If one leaf was out of place, she'd grab her rake and fix it. Then she'd look across the street at Jake's house. Still a mess, she'd grumble. She'd grab her clipboard and start her day of watching. She didn't have a job like most people. Her job was running the HOA, and she took it super seriously. Too seriously, if you ask me. By now, you're probably wondering, what's Jake's deal? Why's he so chill when Karen's being so mean? Well, that's the fun of the story. Jake wasn't just fixing a house. He was waiting for the perfect moment. A moment when everything would change. Karen thought she was in charge, but she didn't know the truth. Jake had something up his sleeve, something big and wild. And when it came out? Oh boy, Karen's jaw was going to hit the floor. Picture this, Jake hammering a nail into his porch, the sun shining bright. Karen's over there, scribbling on her clipboard, thinking she's the smartest person around. She had no clue what Jake was hiding. She thought he was just some guy who didn't know her rules. But Jake? He knew more than she could ever guess. He wasn't scared of her clipboard or her glares. He was ready for whatever she threw at him. And trust me, things were about to get crazy. So, What do you think Jake's secret is? Could he be a spy? A prince in hiding? Maybe he's got superpowers. I'm not spilling the beans yet. You've got to stick with me to find out. This is just the start, and it's going to get even better. Karen thought she ruled Oakwood Lane, but Jake was about to show her she was wrong. How wrong? Well, let's just say her perfect little world was going to flip upside down and it was going to be awesome. Before we move on, I've got a question for you. Have you ever met someone who seemed normal but turned out to be super cool or surprising? Maybe a friend or a neighbor. Think about it while we keep going. Jake's story is just heating up, and you won't believe what happens next. Ready? Let's see what Karen does when she finally snaps and how Jake's secret starts to peek out. Stick around, because this is going to be a wild ride. Karen didn't waste a single second. The very first day Jake moved into Oakwood Lane, she was ready to pounce. She put on her fancy slippers, grabbed her clipboard, and marched right across the street. Her nose was stuck up high in the air, like she was the queen of everything. When she got to Jake's house, she didn't even knock. She just stood there, hands on her hips, and barked, "Your mailbox is 2 inches too tall. Fix it right now, or I'm reporting you to the HOA." Her voice was loud and sharp, like a dog yapping at a stranger. Jake was outside, unloading boxes from his truck. He stopped what he was doing and looked at her. He didn't yell back or get mad. Nope, he just smiled a nice, easy smile and said, "Sure thing, ma'am. I'll take care of it." His voice was calm, like he didn't have a worry in the world. Karen blinked, surprised he didn't argue. She was used to people fighting back or saying sorry a million times. But Jake? He just nodded and went back to his boxes. Karen huffed, turned around, and stomped back to her perfect house. She wasn't happy. Not one bit. You'd think that would be the end of it, right? Wrong. Karen wasn't done, not even close. She decided Jake was her new project. Every single day, she found something new to complain about. It was like a game to her, but a mean one. One morning, she looked out her window and saw Jake's grass. It was a tiny bit longer than she liked. "His grass is too long," she shouted to no one, scribbling it down on her clipboard. She marched over again and said, "Cut your grass, or I'll fine you." Jake looked at the grass, then at her, and smiled again. "Okay, I'll mow it tomorrow," he said. Calm as ever. The next day, it was something else. Karen heard Jake start his car to go get some paint. The engine made a little rumble, nothing loud, just a normal car sound. But to Karen, it was like a monster roaring through her quiet street. She ran outside, waving her arms, and yelled, "Your car is too loud. This is a peaceful neighborhood." Jake poked his head out the window and said, "Sorry, ma'am. I'll get it checked." He wasn't mad. He didn't roll his eyes. He just drove off, nice and slow, while Karen glared at him the whole time. And then get this, Karen even got mad at Jake's shadow. Yep, his shadow. One sunny afternoon, Jake was standing on his porch, drinking some water. The sun was behind him, and his shadow stretched across the street a little. It didn't touch Karen's yard or anything, but she saw it anyway. "Your shadow is in my way," she snapped, pointing at the ground like it was a big crime. Jake looked at the shadow, then at her, and scratched his head. I'll try to stand somewhere else," he said, still smiling. Karen didn't know what to say to that. She just turned red and stormed off. Every time Karen complained, she'd pull out her big HOA handbook. It was a thick book full of rules about grass, rules about cars, rules about everything. She'd wave it around like it was magic, saying, "This neighborhood has rules, and you better follow them." Her voice was so bossy, it made dogs hide under porches. She acted like the handbook was a royal decree, like something a king would write to boss people around. To Karen, those rules were the most important thing in the world. And Jake? She thought he was breaking them all. But here's the funny thing, Jake didn't fight back. Not once. No matter what Karen said, he stayed cool. If she yelled about his mailbox, he'd say, "I'll fix it." If she complained about his grass, he'd say, "I'll mow it." If she griped about his car, he'd say, "I'll check it." He never raised his voice or got annoyed. He just smiled and nodded, like Karen's yelling was no big deal. To anyone watching, it looked like Jake was the nicest guy ever. And maybe he was, but there was more to him than that. Behind those quiet eyes, something was going on. Jake wasn't scared of Karen. Nope, not even a little. Most people would get mad or nervous if someone like Karen kept picking on them. But Jake? He was different. He didn't flinch when she barked at him. He didn't run away when she waved her handbook. He just kept doing his thing, fixing his house, watering his plants, waving at the neighbors. It was like he knew something Karen didn't. Like he had a trick up his sleeve, and he was waiting for the right time to use it. What was he waiting for? Oh, you'll see. I'm not telling you yet, because that's the fun part of the story. But let's just say Jake wasn't worried about Karen's rules or her clipboard or her mean stares. He had a plan, or maybe he was just super chill. Either way, something was brewing inside him, like a pot of soup simmering on the stove. You couldn't see it, but it was there, getting ready to bubble up. Karen didn't notice any of this. She was too busy being mad. Every day, she'd wake up, look out her window, and find something to nag about. One time, Jake put a little birdhouse in his tree. It was cute, painted red with a tiny hole for birds. The other neighbors loved it. "Ah, that's so nice," Mrs. Carter said. But Karen? She hated it. "That birdhouse is against the rules," she shouted, storming over. "Take it down, or I'll make you." Jake looked at the birdhouse, then at her, and said, "I'll check the rules, ma'am." Same old Jake, calm and polite. The neighbors started talking about it. "Karen's picking on Jake too much," Mr. Johnson whispered to his wife. "He's not hurting anyone," Mrs. Carter said back. They felt bad for Jake. He was new, and all he wanted was to fix his house and live quietly. But Karen wouldn't let him. She was like a buzzing bee, always flying around, looking for someone to sting. And Jake was her favorite target. One afternoon, Karen saw Jake carrying a ladder to fix his roof. The ladder clanked a little when he set it down, not loud, just a tiny noise. But Karen heard it from across the street. She ran out her door, yelling, "That ladder is too noisy. You're disturbing the peace." Jake wiped sweat off his forehead and said, "Sorry, ma'am. I'll be quieter." He didn't argue. He didn't tell her she was being silly. He just picked up the ladder and moved it slowly, like he was trying not to bug her. By now, you're probably thinking, why doesn't Jake tell her to stop? That's what most people would do, right? If someone kept yelling at you for no reason, you'd say, "Leave me alone," or "Stop being mean." But Jake didn't. He stayed nice, even when Karen was at her grumpiest. It was almost weird how calm he was. Did he like being bossed around? Nope. Was he afraid of her? Not at all. So what was his deal? Why didn't he snap back? Here's a little hint: Jake wasn't just being nice to be nice. He had a reason. Behind that smile and those polite words, something was hiding. Karen thought she was winning. She thought Jake was weak because he didn't fight. But she was wrong, oh, so wrong. Jake wasn't weak. He was smart. He was patient. And he was waiting for something big. What was it? Don't worry, I'll tell you soon. But not yet. Let's talk about Karen for a minute. She wasn't always this mean, at least, that's what some neighbors said. A long time ago, before Jake moved in, Karen was just a regular lady. She liked rules back then too, but she didn't yell as much. She'd smile sometimes and even bring cookies to HOA meetings. But over the years, she got Bozier. She started thinking she was better than everyone else. When she became the HOA leader, it got worse. Now, she acted like the neighborhood was hers to control. Jake showing up was like throwing a rock into her perfect little pond. It made waves, and Karen hated waves. She wanted everything to stay the same, neat, quiet, and under her thumb. But Jake? He didn't fit her plan. His house was old and messy at first. His truck was big. His grass wasn't perfect. To Karen, that made him a problem. And she didn't like problems, she liked fixing them, her way. So every day, the battle went on. Karen would find something to complain about, and Jake would nod and smile. She'd yell, "Your porch light is too bright." He'd say, "I'll turn it down." She'd snap, "Your trash can is ugly." He'd say, "I'll get a new one." It was like a game of cat and mouse, but the mouse wasn't running. The mouse was just sitting there, grinning, while the cat got madder and madder. The neighbors watched it all happen. Some of them started rooting for Jake. "He's so nice," they'd say. "Karen needs to leave him alone." Others thought Jake was too quiet. "Why doesn't he stand up to her?" they'd ask. But nobody knew the truth, not yet. Jake wasn't just taking it. He wasn't just letting Karen win. He was waiting. Waiting for what? "Oh, it's coming, trust me." Picture this: Karen standing on her porch, clipboard in hand, staring at Jake's house. Her eyes are narrow, her mouth is a tight line. Across the street, Jake sweeping his porch, whistling a happy tune. Karen mutters, "He's up to something. I'll catch him." But Jake? He's not sweating it. He sweeps, he smiles, he waves at a kid biking by. He's cool as a cucumber, while Karen's steaming like a pot of hot soup. Weeks went by, and things in Oakwood Lane started heating up. Karen wasn't just grumpy anymore, she was getting bolder, like a lion ready to roar. Every day, she watched Jake closer and closer. She'd stand on her porch with her clipboard, her eyes squinting across the street, looking for anything she could complain about. Jake kept working on his house, fixing things up, staying quiet like always. But Karen? She was done with quiet. She wanted to make noise, and boy, did she ever. One sunny day, something crazy happened. Karen was outside, checking her perfect lawn. It was so green and neat, like a picture in a magazine. She loved her lawn more than anything. Then, she looked up and saw Jake's mailbox. The sun was shining just right, and the mailbox was casting a long shadow. That shadow stretched all the way across the street and touched the edge of Karen's grass. It wasn't a big deal to most people. Shadows happen all the time, right? But to Karen, it was like a monster had invaded her yard. That was at her breaking point. Karen's face turned red, and her eyes got wide. She threw her clipboard down on the porch and yelled, "No way. This is too much." She stormed inside her house, her slippers slapping the ground. She grabbed her phone, punched in 911, and started shrieking into it. "Help! There's a trespasser on my property," she screamed. "His mailbox shadow is invading my space. Do something." Her voice was so loud, you could hear it through the windows. She sounded like a siren going off. The person on the phone, the 911 operator, tried to calm her down. "Ma'am, please, tell me what's happening," the operator said. "Is someone hurting you?" But Karen wouldn't listen. "No, it's worse," she shouted. "It's his shadow. It's on my lawn. Get the police here now." The operator probably thought she was nuts, but Karen didn't care. She slammed the phone down and marched back outside, arms crossed, waiting for the cops to show up. She was sure she'd won this time. Meanwhile, Jake was across the street, sitting on his porch. He had a cup of coffee in his hand, steam curling up from it. He leaned back in his chair, watching Karen lose her mind. He didn't say a word, not one single word. He just sipped his coffee, slow and easy, like it was any other day. The sun was warm, the birds were chirping, and Jake looked totally relaxed. But if you looked really close, you'd see something. A tiny twitch on